Hello. Now that you've had some experience with CSS, we should talk about classes and IDs and how to use them. Now, classes and IDs appear in both HTML and in CSS, and they're also used by JavaScript, which we haven't started looking at yet. But they're quite important. Knowing how to use them is essential to developing web apps. So I've got an HTML page here with a poem on it. And I'll show you the markup. So the markup is really simple. There are no divs. There is one heading. There is a paragraph with the author's name. And then the 7 verses of the poem are each in a paragraph. They're in a P element. And because it's a poem, each paragraph also includes BR elements for line endings and spans to enable the indentations. So each of the paragraphs is set up the same way. And you might notice that what does differ is each paragraph has a different class until we get down to the 5th, 6th, and 7th, then the classes repeat. So the last verse has a class of blue1 on the paragraph, on the P element. And the first verse has the same class, blue1. Other classes are blue2, blue3, and brown. Now let's look at the CSS for a moment. The CSS does not have any of those classes styled, but the rules are set up to save us time. So you can see the list of the classes that I've got in the document. And when you put the class into a CSS style sheet, you have to put a dot in front of its name. No quotation marks, the exact same class name with a dot in front of it in the CSS file. In the HTML file, inside the element that you want to be styled, you put class equals, no spaces, class equals quotation, name of the class, and the quotation mark. So that comes inside the tag of the element that you're going to style. So let's see again what our page looks like. Okay, so no colors, and what I'm going to do is apply a style to class named blue1. So I'm going to paste this in. It's a background color and a text color different from what we've got. So I save, I flip over to my browser, I reload, and I can see that both of the P elements with the class of blue1 have been changed in both their background color and their color, which affects the foreground elements, the text and the border. Now that we see this, since I'm going to apply a background color to every verse of the poem, I realize that perhaps I want some padding inside that P element. But I'm going to need the same padding inside every P element in the poem. So I'm not going to change padding or margin inside the individual classes. I am going to instead change padding and margin for every single P element because my P elements, I'm thinking, are all the same. So you try to be efficient. If you want all your P elements to be the same in some respects and different in only a few, such as their background color, then choose where you're going to apply styles that affect everything versus the styles that affect only that class. So let's see what our new P styles have done to the document in the browser. And we've made some big spaces in between each verse, but they're going to look more sensible once we've got background colors on every P. And you look inside our class of blue1 and you see a pretty nice spacing around the verse. So I'm going to line up my editor and my browser, and let's apply styles to the remaining 4 classes that affect the poem verses. So I'm going to copy and paste each of those. So I've now added some style declarations to each of the 4 classes that affect the way the verses of the poem appear. For the second and the third, I have only changed the background color. And for the middle one, which is the 4th, there are 7 verses, so this is the one in the middle, I have changed the background, the text color, the font weight, and I have also added a text shadow. So in any class, you can change the font family, the font size, the margins, the padding, any CSS at all, you can change or alter within a class. And then by applying that class to a particular element, which could be a div, a paragraph, an article, an aside, a section, an image, a heading, anything at all, by adding that class within the opening tag of the element, you make all these changes. So I will save, I'll go over here and I'll reload, and now we'll see that each verse in the poem has a style applied. They repeat after the 4th one, which is the fanciest one, this one with the brown background. That's the one that has a text shadow on it. And this is the end of the page. So different styles are applied, and because I wanted to repeat some styles, blue 1, that class, is applied on the first paragraph and the last. Blue 2 is applied to the next to last verse and the second. Blue 3 is applied to the 3rd verse and also the 5th verse. So I didn't have to write separate classes for every single P element. I could simply apply a class again. And I'll show you that in the HTML. So the first P has the class of blue 1. The second P has the class of blue 2. And at the end, the last P has the class of blue 1 again. And the next to last has the class of blue 2. So classes can be reused. This is efficient also. It's also important to note that just because I wrote these classes for the P elements, these classes could be applied to any element at all. So what if I go into one of these span elements that already exists and I add to that span the class of brown, which you've seen is the one that really looks very different from the others. So I've simply added class equals quote brown quote into this span that's in the next to the last paragraph. And I'll save and I'll reload, and all of a sudden that style is applied only to that span, not to that entire P element. So I could also apply it to, say, the next span in the same verse. Save, reload. Or I could make that second one possibly the blue 1 class. Save, reload, right? So just because you wrote a class for a particular kind of element doesn't limit you to using it for that element. Let's also look at the author name, or you could think of it as the byline on this poem. And perhaps we realize that we don't need so much space above and below the author name as we do within the other P elements. And perhaps we don't want to indent it the way that we did the verses of the poem. We want it to be closer to the title of the poem and with the same left alignment as the title of the poem. Well, we could change that in our CSS because we've got a class of author on that P element. And what we can do is we can alter these things that we've done to the other P elements. We can change for just that one P element, the one with the class of author, and make it have different margin and different padding. So if I paste in something that I've copied, so I'm changing the margin and padding only on the paragraph with the class of author, and I reload, and I have very much changed the space around top, bottom, and left around the byline by Lewis Carroll. Now, in this video, up until now, we have only talked about classes. We have only shown classes. So there are also IDs. How are these different? Well, an ID can be used to define anything that a class can be used to define. But an ID must not ever be used more than once in one HTML document. So if you have an ID and you use it in an HTML file, you cannot use it a second time or more than that. So we have some classes here that we have used more than once, and I'm going to do some things that aren't okay to demonstrate how IDs and classes might be different. So first I'm going to go into the HTML file, and I'm going to change the two places where I have class equals blue1 to ID equals blue1, right? So this is how you would indicate an ID, although as soon as you did it a second time, you would be breaking all the rules of web standards, okay? So I'm going to save and reload. And so the first thing you'll see is that I've lost my styles altogether, because in the CSS document, you have to indicate an ID in a different way. So while a class is indicated by a preceding dot, an ID is indicated by a preceding hash mark or an octothorpe. So if you've got a hash in front of a name, then that is an ID name, and it will work with ID. So I save, I go over here, and I reload, and my styles are back on both my first paragraph and the last, just like they were before. Okay, great, swell. So it appears to work the same as a class, even though there's this prohibition: only use an ID once on any HTML page. Well, we're going to see why in just a moment. So I'm going to make this wide so you can see this well. So it's very important when you're learning, and even later as you make more complex pages and you get better at markup and CSS and everything else, it's important to make sure that both your HTML and your CSS validate. Because if you're not writing standards compliant HTML and CSS, then your designs and your layouts, the way your page looks, and the ability of people to even read it at all might be compromised on different devices, different browsers that you haven't specifically tested. So by using a validator, I can upload the file that I've been working on my local machine, and it is called index.html. And so if I open it and then I click validate, what I will find is that I've got a red error, and the error message says duplicate ID blue1. The red box indicates that this page, my index.html, does not validate. It's not valid HTML because of that duplicate ID. So even though it appears to work fine in your browser, you've got invalid HTML, and that means probably your page is not going to render properly, or something's going to go wrong on some device somewhere. And you can avoid that by using IDs and classes correctly. You never want to allow any red error in the validator to remain. You need to go back and fix that. So we can, of course, fix it by changing this back to a class as it was in the beginning. And it will also have to be changed to a class in the HTML. So there's a coordination between class and ID in both the CSS file and in the HTML file. Upload my file again and validate, that's what you want to see. You want to see that green box that says this document is valid HTML5. So, classes and IDs. Use classes unless you need to use an ID. You know you need a single unique ID. Otherwise, write classes. As far as CSS goes, you don't need a class if you want to style all of an element the same way. You want to style all your P elements the same way, all your article elements the same way. You don't need to add any classes. But when you want an element to differ from others of its kind, you want to apply specific styles that are going to vary on paragraphs, on headings, on divs. Then you can't use the element selector, such as div or P or article or section. You have to apply a class and then put that class into the element tag, the opening tag, so that those styles apply to that element.